All right, welcome to our risk assessment in Medtech, sponsored by Pulse Forward. Uh, we will be talking about risk over the next 30 to 40 minutes as it pertains to medical device and medical engineering. This webinar is brought to you by Pulse Forward. We help medical device companies from startup to established in their needs when it comes to services, anything from software and system architects to usability and system engineers, and anything in between. Pulse Forward helps you with your services to get to the next stage. And with that, we will start the webinar on risk assessment. Before we jump in, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Cliff, would you mind just talking a little bit about yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Cliff Rockwell. I have 27 years of medical device experience. I worked for Boston Scientific and currently I work for CVRX. In that time, I have done supplier engineering, quality engineering, operations, and test engineering, and currently I am a technical fellow systems engineer.
Awesome. Thanks, Cliff. Brian?
Yeah, I'm a system engineer, over 25 years of experience. Worked at Medtronic, Boston Scientific, and a number of startup companies.
Thanks, Brian. Steve?
And I'm Steve Zielinski. I'm a certified system engineering professional with experience at Boston Scientific, Medtronic, and a number of startup. And I'm also the AI and ML track lead for the INCOSE Systems Engineering in Healthcare Conference.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you, gentlemen. We have lots of experience on the panel here. We thought we would start things off with the state of risk and just kind of get a little bit of a state of the state and understand some challenges. Brian, would you mind kicking us off kind of around some of the challenges that we see with risk in medtech?
Yeah, I think the important message is that risk management is a continuous process. It starts with building your hazard analysis and doing your FMEAs, and then continues with linking that to uh, design outputs and design inputs, and so requirements and finished product verification tests, proving that risks are mitigated, and then continues with post-market surveillance, looking at what failure modes you're seeing in the field, and bringing those back to your risk file, often in the FMEA, to make sure you've got your occurrences properly assessed and your severities properly assessed, and to add new risks to add new to address new issues that have come up in the fields. Sometimes that's adding new risks in the FMEA. So, the challenge is sometimes when we hit FDA audits is that some of those pieces are missing.
Cliff or Steve, anything else to add?
Yeah, a challenge that I see in the risk management process is the work that can go into linking the different aspects of risk management to each other. For example, connecting risks to requirements, connecting requirements to the means by which they're tested. Processes that don't work well are processes where that linking is done manually and the linking is not easily visible to the users. The processes that work well are the processes where, for example, if you're looking at a requirement, you have an easy way to see right on your screen which risks that requirement relates to. That helps users when they are considering changing a requirement or adding a new requirement. They can be reminded to consider the risks that that requirement relates to.
And
Yeah,
I
I
think,
agree. So,
all
go
right,
ahead, Steve.
I think one of the challenges is also that every company does these things slightly differently. So we don't see much consistency from company to company. Everybody's got their own Excel sheet, or maybe their own internal tool, or maybe they're using a third-party tool, but it's always done just a little bit differently.
Yeah, I agree. And I was going to add on to Cliff's comment that, yeah, so a lot of times you look at a requirement, it's not obvious that it might impact risk. And so just to highlight that, the importance of having that linkage.
Oh, great. Thank you. Let's move on to maybe some risk estimation and evaluation. Brian, did you want to start us off here again?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, we've got some great questions here. I think, we're thinking about the first question, what are the biggest challenges in performing effective and defensible risk assessments within an FMEA? I, a lot of times, some things I've come up, I've experienced are just discussions about whether or not a failure mode even is a risk in the first place. And I usually take the position that if it's a failure mode, then you need to at least assess it to see could that failure lead to an hazardous outcome, and and then assess it. And sometimes that can mean putting in your FMA the conclusion that there's no patient harm associated with this, and sometimes that leads to discussions about whether or not you should even have the item in there at all, depending on just depending on what the just depending on other context. Um, Another challenge that comes up is really just coming to agreements on what severity rankings and occurrence rankings should be, from the start, even from the start, establishing your guidelines for what it means to be a low risk or a high risk. How many failures do you have to see to qualify as improbable or frequent, and then what harms lead to what severities. And a good way we try to tackle it is by creating tables to guide the decision. So if it's an injury like a scratch or a cut that heals without needing treatment, or without needing more than like a first aid treatment, that might be somewhere in like a level 3 severity or even a level 2. Whereas if it results in death, then that's clearly a level 5. And so a lot of times we create tables indicating, based on the hazardous outcomes we can see, what level of severity we would assign those to. And that helps us to get to those decision points. But that can still be a point of discussion that we have a lot.
So I would say some of the biggest challenges I've seen have also been, well, right at the top actually, which is confusion about the difference between a hazard analysis and an FMEA. That kind of starts it. They're fundamentally different things, but often companies will confuse those things, and then they'll sort of create a lot more work for themselves because of that. The second thing I would say right away is software risk, cybersecurity risk, and usability risk are all really different animals than your traditional electrical and or mechanical risk items. And you shouldn't treat all those things the same. And those things, especially usability and cybersecurity, people often overlook that as far as the FDA is concerned, the probability of occurrence of those items is a 1. So you'll still see people trying to estimate the probability of occurrence. And then my final comment is that for most of my career, I've lived in a world of new product development and often, with startups. And there isn't a data-driven input. And so you've got to make some kind of estimate of the probability of occurrence just based on, either external data or your own engineering judgment. And that can cause, some companies to spin on that quite a bit. So avoiding that is a key thing to keeping your workload under control.
Related to occurrence, the technique CVRX uses to minimize debate about occurrence in the absence of definitive data. We just declare occurrence to be high unless there's data proven otherwise. And then after implementing the mitigations for the risk that we decided were necessary and proving that those mitigations, which are requirements, proving that those requirements are met, then we declare the occurrence to be low. And we establish the baseline that we don't have a actual issue for this risk. And then only through post-market signals, complaints, CAPAs, field data, only through one or more of those things would the claim that the occurrence is low be challenged. And so
Yeah, and I've
that last bullet, it's another opportunity to link. There needs to be an easy way for users to connect any of those post-market signals back to a risk. And if you have a post-market signal that doesn't seem to map to one of your risks, then that highlights that you need to make a new risk. And by making those links, it also helps when users are looking at risk to be able to see the degree to which this risk is supported by actual field data versus just a brainstorming exercise that hasn't been observed.
I really like the baseline low based on market signals for like post mitigation risk occurrence. I've seen where you know FMEAs get built up. They still maybe in some cases they estimated post mitigation occurrence ratings, and as data came in, they still don't. I mean, just because FMEAs are large, there's a lot of updates to do. They still don't come back and update those to low, even though they have no uh, signals from post-market surveillance that there's any risk at all. Because those items aren't being updated because they're not the ones the data is coming in for. But because the data is not coming in for you, you'd think you can probably update those to low in the post mitigation. So I just highlighting that I like that baseline.
One other challenge I see with risk management, I think we've alluded to it, the personnel involved like to debate the scores. And so one way to help reduce the debate is to establish from the beginning how many different levels do you need. Each level should correspond to a meaningful action. Like in these three tables, there needs to be a documented action that's taken for green and yellow and red, and each one of those actions needs to be different. If you have more colors and possible options in your matrix, then you have tangible actions that you take, then that could be a sign that you have too many scoring options. And sometimes, people are happy to debate the difference between a 3 and a 4, even if the resulting decision is the same.
Yeah, I like that. And I think we've got the pictures of sort of what you're talking about there, the 3 by 3 versus a 5 by 5 matrix. There's no requirement. It's pretty common to see the 5 by 5 matrix, I think, in many medical device companies. I
Even
think,
even 10 by 10 by 10, I've seen for severity, occurrence, and detection. And there's no way people take 1,000 discrete, tangible, different actions depending on each of those scoring possibilities.
yeah, and I mean it's great when you can simplify to something like a 3 by 3 and really drive um, action forward, which is I think you were saying that that helps you resolve the just you were saying something about when you get issues in you you make sure the mitigations are in place and you drive it to resolution and then you put a low occurrence on it because the mitigations are in place and tested and so I think I like the 3 by 3 as an action driven or something that helps drive action on closing risks out basically in FMEA or in your risk file because it doesn't. I keep saying in the FMEA because I think it's common to track risk status in FMEA, but it's not the only way to do it.
And then one final thing, I think the other challenge is the whole process needs to be easy. I would argue it should be possible to add a new risk to your risk file, write your change order, get it approved and released in 15 minutes of work. That's a good
Yeah.
goal, because if it takes hours, then what will inevitably happen is you have risks that aren't in your risk file. And that's the bigger issue than you misclassified your severity by a point, is all the risks that aren't in there at all. But the way to motivate people to have it be a comprehensive list of every risk is to make sure that the process is easy to make the update, justify the update, and get it released in your system.
Yeah, that's huge.
Cliff and or Brian or Steve, one of the things that I believe we had talked about earlier was I really understand the 3x3 matrix and why that helps get to like almost a product no go or go type decision. When you have a larger matrix, like say a 5x5, is can somebody maybe speak to, you know, that I think can help show maybe a little bit of like risk reduction and just some of the importance of that, or you know, or is that a reason why you would have more, or is, you know, what would be some reasons that organizations may want a 5x5, you know, or 4x4, or just something larger than say a 3x3? I'll put that out to the group.
Anybody want to go first?
Mm-hmm.
I use the 3x3. I think that works well for a smaller company. CVRX is an early stage medtech company that we don't have the field data driving more than 3 levels of occurrence, for example. But one way I could see it being useful is if you want to prioritize the risk mitigations. If your risk assessment is identifying many things to change, it could be useful to say that we're going to tackle the ones in these boxes first and the ones in these boxes second. And if you only have 9 boxes, then it would be more difficult to separate higher and lower priority items.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought. I don't know, Steve, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say it maybe is a legacy thing too, right? I certainly agree with Cliff. I think 3x3 would frequently be just fine. And in fact, to your question, Michael, I think it's just fine even to show the change from a risk going from high to low. I think other companies, though, might have simply a legacy of the 5x5, and maybe they just see it as too big a change or a cultural change to move away from that, which might be the biggest argument to stay with it.
I agree with that too. And I think both those things are um, pretty high up on my list on the reasons too. So I'm going to add some other reasons, but these may be less important. I mean, to Cliff's point, prioritization. I think that this ties into it. Sometimes you have severities where you know, in the 3x3 you're being very crisp. It's either serious, critical, or low. And actually, I like to use the term low, whereas in the 5x5 we usually at our lowest level is called negligible, is often negligible from company to company. And so sometimes you want to show that, hey, you know, there could be some effects and they're not really serious, but they're also not nothing. They're not negligible. And so that creates that level in between. And then on the other side also, it's, well, this might require medical treatment, but you're not going to die. So you have that idea of major between the serious and the critical. And that leads to the risk prioritization that Cliff was talking about. So now you can take care of these highest level risks first and the lower level risks later. It just helps you get some separation. And then um, I thought I had a thought related to Steve's point also. But yeah, so kind of related to Steve's point about legacy, sometimes, especially you have a device that's in the field, it depends on your risk benefit, you know, assessment or risk benefit analysis. So, I mean, medical devices, a lot of medical devices just carry inherent risks, and you might not be able to mitigate everything down to, negligible, which again, having a low severity helps. But yeah, I like that term low as opposed to negligible on the 3x3. But if you can't get it out, your risk, it's really your risk benefit analysis that should be driving the colors of these boxes, or they should be maybe not driving, but validating or supporting the colors of these boxes. If the benefit the device is providing outweighs the risk that the residual risk the device still presents, then you want to demonstrate that it's okay to go forward with. And so having the 5x5 might help with that risk benefit analysis. Um, or help with supporting the arguments that the benefit outweighs the residual risk. And then 3x3, on the other hand, is just really effective for driving um, fixes into the system, mitigations into the system. So if you're able to mitigate all your risks away, or at least into low level, um, then that, I mean, this is it's a good tool because you can aim for that goal of doing your risk assessments in 15 minutes or less, and then that lets you move on to creating mitigations. So
No,
I think
thanks, Brian.
that's a good contrast.
No, thanks
I,
everybody. That's good. Go ahead, Cliff.
I have one more comment related to bullet 4. I don't think we've talked about this. 4 risks that are understood as inherent in the process. As Brian was saying, take infection for an implantable device as an example. I've seen it done effectively to use a relative scale for the occurrence rating. So like both of these tables are suggesting that you need to calculate a fixed occurrence that determines high, medium, and low deterministically. I think it is reasonable to use an occurrence ranking where low is, say, significantly below the risk that is accepted by users. So, say for an infection, I've seen numbers that, depending on the surgical procedure, an infection may have a likelihood of 1%. And so, if your procedure is like that, you could say that a root cause, a risk that leads to an infection risk, but that risk is well below 1%, you could call that low, even if, say, according to these numbers, it might be 1 chance in 300, and then this scale might suggest it should be high. But I've seen a relative scale that I think can be useful for risks like that. And then medium would be in line with what's tolerated by users, and high would be significantly worse than what a user would normally expect.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, it's occurrence of harm, right? So yeah, if the rates are low, then
Yeah.
that impacts your occurrence of harm.
Great. Well, this sounds like a good point for us to move to the next slide. But no, that's great information. I really like the slide. This next slide about more just generally software risk assessment. Brian, you want to start us off again on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of key off the first bullet to start off. I think, I've been finding I'm working right now with a client on a new software architecture, and um, there it's just the questions keep coming up as well. What are the where are the risks going to be presented so that we can start designing mitigations into the architecture from the start? So I almost would say that, I mean, you really want to consider the risk assessment right from the start. And yet so often we formally start documenting it at least later in the process. So I mean, I think every startup project I've done, we always are thinking about the risks from the start. And we're thinking about those mitigations, and we're starting to work on the design, taking into consideration from the beginning. But a lot of times the formal documentation of that happens after the formal documentation of, or after some of the formal, or maybe it's not formal, but after some of the development of even the code or design documents. But before they've been, but certainly that gets finished before there's any kind of release, or even progression through. There's usually design review phase gates. So that formal risk documentation always gets completed at the appropriate phase gate, depending on the company.
Yeah,
Um,
this
Go
is
ahead.
sort of the exact moment, right? When I'm sort of passionate about this, right? Which is people need to understand that a hazard analysis, and this is the answer to your question is when does it begin? Well, it begins with a hazard analysis, and a hazard analysis comes into existence before a design has been conceived. So you are looking at device risks, the ability of the device to cause harm at a system level before you've created a design even. And so that's the appropriate point to look at, okay, well, and really for the most part, often what you're doing at that point is asking, how does software interact with the redundant aspects of the system to, create a safe system or to avoid the probability of harm. So you're looking at software often as more of a mitigator rather than the source of a risk. But it begins before you've put a design on paper.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it does. It's always whether I've just, I think just to tie it to my previous comments, I've just observed. I think that the hazard analysis is always in people's minds when they start working on things. But I've also seen that they've got to get vendors lined up early on, and so there's some higher level architecture. But I agree with the point that the hazard analysis comes first, and I think that and also with especially the particular point that Steve's making that the hazard analysis is different than the FMEA. So in the hazard analysis, you're identifying what are the types of harms, what are the types of hazards that could lead to harms um, in the system before you consider specific failure modes. And I also agree with Steve's point that software is often a mitigation uh, for other functions in the system.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing. Sorry, Cliff.
Fine.
But it's uh, hazards and harm are system level properties, right? For the most part, right? Broadly speaking, software can't cause a harm, right? Software alone can't cause an over temperature leading to an ablation, right? Software alone can't, send something out of control. And there are other mitigations at a system level that should effectively remove that possibility. So if we take the very famous case, of the Therac 25, that was, many years ago, the radiation machine that uh, software was pointed out as a significant contributor to a number of deaths from an overdose of radiation. Uh, and fair, but the problem was, of course, why was the system at all capable of delivering a dose of radiation that would kill someone? Right? That should have been locked out in multiple other ways and not just have been a property of the software. So I think people need to also see this at a system level.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is partly at least that the software has to um, trigger some other functionality ultimately in hardware to reconnect with the real world before it can cause harm to a patient.
Exactly.
I like to restate something you guys said in maybe a simpler way. A hazard analysis is a top-down exercise that starts with the final harms and then works its way down to specific root causes that can contribute to those harms, whereas an FMEA is a bottom-up approach. So both can be useful, but they're coming from different sides of the hierarchical tree of risk management.
Yeah, I agree, and that's where the differences really show up between software and hardware mechanical. Uh, with In the case of hardware mechanical, is you can look at individual components because they're physical things that exist, and you can look at the ways that they fail, and they might fail from stress, from multiple uses, from from electrical safety conditions that we consider like EMI and over voltage and ESD. Um, and when those fail, it's often with FMEAs, we always say we can look at them with single fault failure modes, and 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 that's just how. Sorry, I'm not to say that you can't have dual faults in hardware, but you can look at single faults, and that allows you to kind of limit the scope of the FMEA because it is a bottom-up process. Software, though, is different because software components are they're a little bit ephemeral. I mean, what is a component today could be refactored into multiple components tomorrow, or what's multiple components tomorrow could be refactored into a single component, or what's multiple components today could be refactored into a single component.
Yeah, this is really touching on, I like our sort of ultimate question there. If I could redesign a software FMEA from scratch, I would get rid of even the concept of a software FMEA. It doesn't fit, right? Our
We don't use
failure.
it. CBRX doesn't use it. We're hazard analysis only, top down only for software.
And that's genius, right? Because so many companies still label something a software FMEA, and in fact, then they do the next worst thing, which is they attempt to use the paradigm from hardware FMEA, which is one of wear out, right? Repeated use, and they attempt to look at that and try and apply that to a world of software, and it's simply a mismatch. It doesn't work well. And so the trick is not to go down that path in the first place.
Yeah, I haven't
Guys,
seen any regulatory. I've never had a regulator in my 17 years at a smaller company question our philosophy on software or firmware risk analysis as a top down only. Hasn't ever come up that that was insufficient.
how do you track, or so I guess one question is, do you have you so when you go to post-market surveillance, you often update the FMEA's occurrence ratings and for risk items and add occurrences for risk items. How do you track when you're doing top down? Do you have it? I kind of know because we've talked a little bit before, but I mean, even on the previous slide that you fix up. But I mean, do you have any situations where you have to track risk post-market surveillance for firmware that maybe you don't get to fix right away?
Well, just as far as tracking, the top down approach certainly gets down to the bottom level of specific failure modes that software or firmware could cause. So if you get a complaint from the field related to a bug, then first of all, you make sure you have that risk defined. If you don't, you define it and then you link the bug to the risk. And if it's of any significance at all, it should increase your probability of occurrence. You thought that risk was low because you didn't think you weren't aware of any issues, but now you are aware. So then you would increase that occurrence to something higher than low, and then your process should then compel you to take additional actions to restore that risk back to low. Or if you
Yeah, I
decide
think
that it is inherent in the process, then you would have to do a benefit risk analysis and justify why some rate of occurrence is acceptable.
I think also this is a moment when the English language also, sorry for the double meaning here, fails us, right? Which is A bug isn't a failure in the same way that an FMEA means failure, right? Which is more that wear out or that issue of something over time failing. A software bug means the software was incorrect when it went to the field. It doesn't mean that it wore out. And so sometimes it's useful to really just keep your software language as was the software correct or incorrect? Or maybe there you can use the word discrepancy, right? There's a discrepancy between the way the software was expected to work and how it actually worked. But again, you don't want to kind of walk down into that world of FMEA based on a bug. They're really fundamentally different things.
Yeah,
No,
no, I
that's
think that's interesting thoughts.
great. We'll move on to the next slide. I think these are just a lot of great information that we covered. Um, Brian, how about some key takeaways and what good looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw in the discussion on the previous slides that risk assessment is a continuous process, and Cliff described a great system where they're able to get their risk assessments complete within 15 minutes, um, and they just drive fixes to the system immediately to get them out, and that shows a continuous process from post-market surveillance uh, back to the design and design improvement and the risk assessment. Um, when I think about that second bullet point, um, we had some good discussion around how being able to do your scoring clearly and efficiently and driving action can sometimes beat complex scoring. And then we had some discussion about when the more complex scoring might have some benefit. But either way, your ability to have the clear rationale, through good upfront hazard analysis, to drive those decisions and that action is important. And yeah, when you have good risk management, then you don't have then your audits go well, and you don't have delays in getting to market. And that doesn't. And I think there's some interesting stories there with the software FMEAs versus um, just top down risk analysis, risk assessments on software firmware, and how that's been a great success in audits.
No, thanks, Brian. I think with all the great discussion that we just recently had here, for the panel here, if there was one thing that you really wanted to stress around risk management, what might that be?
For me,
Oh,
it's establishing links between the mitigating requirements and the risks, and also links between the low-level risks, the mid-level failure effects, and the high-level harms, and making those links easily viewable. When a user's looking at a requirement, your system should put right next to it, and here's the links to risk, so that it's just there and people see it.
that's great. Thanks, Cliff.
And mine would be don't confuse the paradigm of hardware FMEA with the task of doing software risk assessment.
Brian, any last thoughts on your side as well?
Yeah, I think just um, risk assessment is a vital part of medical device development. I mean, we, there's always risk inherent in medical devices, but we design them because they're beneficial to patients' life, quality of life, and health. So it's always in the end ultimately about, are you providing more benefit than the residual risk that you're left with? And so that risk benefit analysis is key, and these are tools we use to make sure that uh, we keep the device safe and effective.
No, that's great. Thanks, Brian. And thanks, everybody. once again, as we wrap up, just wanted to say thank you to Pulse Forward for any needs that you may have when it comes to services, from software architects to usability to cybersecurity. Pulse Forward has the engineers for your needs. And I wanted to say, once again, a big thank you to our panelists, Cliff, Brian, and Steve. We'll be sending out the file to anyone who's watched it, as well as their information. So thanks again for attending our webinar on risk management, and hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.